500 years ago, these shores received their first European visitors. The Portuguese who arrived created the modern state of Brazil, promoted today for its music, dance, football, beach life. But this image hides a less appealing past. For Brazil was built on the back of the largest forced migration in history. North America is well known for its slave-owning past, but this South American country received 10 times as many, 4 million Africans. Why did Brazil become the world's largest slave-owning country? Why does it rank among the cruelest regimes of the past few centuries? Why is it a story that some still prefer not to tell?
Slavery is an inconvenient history for the Brazilian elite. There is no doubt about that. And they don't want this issue to be discussed.
In the year 1500, a Portuguese fleet, captained by Pedro Alvares Cabral, set sail to round southern Africa, en route for Asia.
Portugal was a tiny country. It only had a population in total of just over 1 million. So for them to send a big fleet was a vast effort. And Portuguese got to Brazil almost by accident. It was a large fleet on its way to India to get spices. And it was blown rather farther west than usual, and then they saw land birds, and they followed them and made a landfall on what's now Brazil.
The lands that stretched before the Portuguese were larger than Europe. It was a remarkable discovery, equaling that of Columbus only 8 years earlier. The Portuguese eagerly sent the news home to Lisbon. Lisbon, Portugal's capital, was the world's center of exploration. Its streets full of sailors, investors, traders, and adventurers. Only a few years previously, Vasco da Gama had finally worked his way around the southern tip of Africa and opened the sea route to the luxuries of the East.
Even though this people is the smallest of all the globe, that globe does not seem large enough to satisfy it. As soon as they have sailed along the coast, they take possession of it and consider it a conquest. Parmentier, French captain.
Cabral staged a mass on the shore of Brazil, and all the Indians watched and were quite impressed by it, because they're interested in seeing the ritual that these strangers had. In that first fleet, the Indians surprised the Portuguese by how open and trusting they were. A couple of Indians came onto the ship with, of course, no clothes on at all, and they just quietly went to sleep. And the only thing they were worried about was that their feather headdresses shouldn't get disturbed as they were sleeping. And then they were just quietly lying on the deck of the ship, totally trusting.
But that trust was misplaced. This new continent seemed to contain little obvious wealth. There were no gold-clad Aztecs or Incas to conquer. The only item of interest was a valuable tree, known in Europe as Brazil wood, which gave the country its new name. But there was nothing to compare with the wealth of Asia. Except for one thing. Its land. Portugal sectioned off Brazil's coastline to rich settlers, but they soon ran into a problem. Plantations are highly labor-intensive, and Portugal's own population was too small to send suitable emigrants. The ambitious new settlers turned to slavery. Portugal, like most of Europe, was no stranger to slavery. 1 in 10 of Lisbon's population was a slave. predominantly from northern Africa. So, all along the Brazilian coast, native Indians found themselves being bribed with their first iron tools or forced at gunpoint to become enslaved.
It's completely anathema to them, to a tribal Indian. They're communistic societies and they work for one another. And also the concept of overproduction is completely alien. They see no need for it. They're living in a very rich country with an evergreen system, so that the game is always out there in the forest and the fish are always there in the rivers. And so that's their supermarket. They see no need to produce too much and have it stored. And then also the concept of one man working for another man or woman is completely alien. It's horrible.
Conditions worsened. Mistreatment, physical assault, even murder. Above all, hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples died from European diseases, smallpox, measles, and the common cold. A plantation could see its workforce of hundreds reduced to a handful in a week. In under 100 years, a population of 4 million Indians was halved. So by the year 1600, the Portuguese, requiring an alternative labor force, had turned to Africa. Portugal had recently colonized southwest Africa, including modern Angola. Only 40 days sailing across the Atlantic, this was now to become, in effect, a people factory.
Angola was the area where most slaves that were taken out of Africa and landed in the American continent came from. People complain about the way that sheep or cattle are transported across the world. Transportation of slaves was very much like that. Perhaps 300 or 400 people packed together with only enough space to lie down, without enough air, without enough water, without enough food to survive. Very often, over half of the cargo, as it were lost from these voyages.
On board ship, in miserable conditions, the terrified slaves remain for weeks, months, and the great number of them who die is unspeakable. De Oliveira Mendes, doctor.
Many vessels, after they arrive, are abandoned from the impossibility of getting any person to clean them. Dr. J. Cliff, slave trader.
A ship enters from Angola and on a single day unloads 500, 600, or perhaps 1,000 slaves. The masters were few, the slaves many. The masters feasting, the slaves dying of hunger. The masters swimming in gold and silver, the slaves weighted down with irons. Vieira, Jesuit priest.
The Portuguese treated Africa as an infinite resource. So they just imported and imported and imported on the assumption that the tap would never be turned off.
A man went around with a hot iron and branded us the same as they would the heads of barrels or any other inanimate goods or merchandise. Gardo Bakaka, African slave.
Almost every house in this place is a large warehouse where the slaves are deposited and customers go to purchase. When one was ordered, he came forward, threw his arms over his head, stamped with his feet, shouted to show the soundness of his lungs, ran up and down the room and was treated exactly like a horse. And when done, he was whipped to his stall. Walsh, Traveller.
Gradually, by the end of the 16th century, the plantations build up their wealth, are able to afford to buy foreign slaves who are not going to escape as readily, and to replace the Brazilian labour that has been used hitherto. And so Brazil becomes the great slave-using colony.
What exactly were these slaves being used for? What was the commodity that caused the Portuguese to colonize these lands as quickly as they could? The answer is sugar. 5 centuries ago, this simple plant was among the most valuable items in Europe. Known since the time of Alexander the Great, sugar was highly valued as spice, medicine, and sweetener. In a world without refrigeration, anything that could mask the taste of rotting food could, literally, be worth its weight in gold. Plantations in Europe had been small and often of poor quality. The vast lands of Brazil offered massive opportunities. Huge quantities of processed sugar were shipped to ports like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Venice. In 1598, a traveller in England noted how Queen Elizabeth's teeth were black from too much sugar. The cause of a queen's poor dentistry was the source of Portugal's new wealth. Sugar was Brazilian gold.
Ser dono de engenho de açúcar, para os valores do século XVII,
being a sugar mill owner in the 17th century was like being the owner today of 3, 4, or 5 oil wells.
Era realmente investimento.
People were making fortunes, huge amounts of money, out of the business of sugar.
Que havia no negócio do açúcar.
Slaves are the hands and the feet of the sugar mill owner, because without them, it is not possible in Brazil to set up, maintain, and develop a plantation, nor to have a functioning mill. Antonil, Jesuit priest.
We often tend to think of slaves just working in the fields, but obviously they worked as carpenters, as builders, and in various other occupations as well. They'd probably work from sunrise to sunset, sometimes 18 or 20 hours a day. It was said that slaves only needed 3 things: bread, cloth, and a stick. In other words, a stick to be beaten with, enough bread to survive, and just a strip of cloth in terms of clothing.
Throughout northeastern Brazil, sugar plantations sprang up. Over 200 such plantations provided the sugar that made Brazil the world's leading producer. Plantation owners often lived like lords. Their slaves lived less well.
There are accounts of mill owners who were truly awful. Some even committed murder. All mills had slave prisons, called tronco, and there were administrators who beat the slaves with stakes. And one of these, a palmatoria, which was used to hit the palm of a hand or the sole of a foot, depending on the slave's behavior. This is a small one. Others were bigger than this.
Eram essas peças aqui e maiores até do que essa. Com a escravidão, o homem passou a ser objeto, uma coisa.
With slavery, men became an object, a thing. And the master, the owner of this man, even had the slave's life in his hands and would suffer no penalties for any acts against a slave. For this reason, the slave was an object. He wasn't even an animal. He was simply an object. His owner could sell him, beat him up, or even kill him.
The system was barbarous. Punishments were severe, being placed in the stocks, being castrated, or execution. Most common by far was whipping.
By order of his master, he was stripped naked, tied to a stake, and whipped by the slaves André and Paulo. The master ordered the attachment of an iron neck piece and chain, and at the end of the chain a tree stump weighing over 60 pounds was fastened. The victim was immediately taken back to the farm with orders to continue work. Toledo Lessa, public prosecutor. Whippings for 9 successive days are an ordinary form of punishment. The accused receives 200 or 300 lashes. The mangled flesh is then cut and pepper and salt applied to the wounds. The tourniquet, hand and neck stocks, thumb screws, manacles, irons, pillories, and many other instruments of punishment are common on our plantations. In some provinces, slaves are exposed for a whole night, tied to a stake over an ant's nest. Burlamac, abolitionist.
People say that the Baron of Cajaíba, who owned the Cajaíba mill near Santo Amaro, was a very mean master, a terrible master. He killed the slaves and was well known for being evil. One day, someone came to visit him and told him how attractive a female slave's breasts were. To please the visitor, as he was leaving, the Baron handed him the slave's breasts on a tray.
Todo mundo tinha medo dele aí.
Everybody was afraid of him. Here he controlled the entire area using these 4 mirrors.
Refletia.
One reflecting the other. These 2 mirrors at the front reflect those at the back.
Aqui por mar. E pelo fundo.
He could see the rooms around him, the gardens out back, and the river out front.
Ele reflete tudo quanto se passar aqui nas 2 partes. Para cá e para cá.
The Baron of Cajaíba was one of many who treated livestock better than slaves. Whereas in the United States the black population rose steadily, in Brazil, despite a far greater rate of importation, it stayed the same. Life expectancy for new arrivals was a mere 6 or 7 years, and slaves born in Brazil lived, on average, only into their early 20s. Why was there this culture of cruelty? In part, it was the particular nature of how the Portuguese sought to extract the most value from their colony. Few settlers brought their wives or families. This colonization was overwhelmingly single and male, and it was impossible for Portugal to discipline immigrants in such a vast area the other side of the Atlantic. Much of the population lived beyond effective control. And who were the settlers? Many were young men, or ambitious gamblers, risking all, who found themselves thrown into a world of wealth, freedom, fornication. Many, too, were criminals or miscreants that Portugal preferred far from home shores. In an atmosphere lacking family, social or state restraint, slaves suffered. If the masculine nature of Portuguese settlement was one reason for the cruelty, another was economics. Although slaves were expensive to purchase, owners of lucrative sugar plantations soon earned a return. If slaves died through poor housing, inadequate food, disease, overwork, or assault, then so be it. There was no shortage of replacements.
When I asked the planter why the death rate among his slaves was so high, and pointed out that this obviously did him great harm, he quickly replied that, on the contrary, it brought him no injury at all, since when he purchased a slave, it was with the purpose of using him for only a single year, after which very few could survive. But nevertheless, he made them work in such a way that he not only recovered the capital employed in their purchase, but also made a considerable profit. Jardin, doctor.
The natural increase of blacks is discouraged from the calculation that it is cheaper to import full-grown slaves than to bring up young ones. Brackenridge, Traveller.
The majority of imported slaves were male. Women were few, children not valued. The desire to raise families was diminished on all sides.
Slave women deliberately attempt to abort themselves so that the children inside their bodies will not be made to suffer what they have suffered. Antonil, Jesuit priest.
The need for slaves multiplied enormously when, in the mid-1690s, gold was discovered in the interior. Slaves were sent to the mines to dig, pan, and extract more wealth for their masters. Brazil's increasing prosperity was channeled into new towns and cities. As Portugal's population remained small, continuing to send few immigrants, and other Europeans preferred the cooler climate and Protestant faith of North America, it was Brazil's black slaves that built and serviced this urban colonization.
The slave is the tiller of soil, the maker of sugar and brandy, the pack animal, the breaker and pulverizer of stones, the cook, the footman, groom, shoemaker, tailor, courier, and carrier. Van Eschwege, Traveller.
Era o escravo que conduzia a cidade.
It was the slaves who ran the city. They were the traders, they were the population, everything. They even managed the city's waste.
Carregadores de excrementos. A cidade não tinha sistema
Tigers were the slaves who carried excrement. The city didn't have sewers, and the excrement was thrown on the beaches.
E tigre, justamente.
The name tiger has nothing to do with being virile. It has to do with the spots that showed up on the bodies of these slaves, who were kept prisoners in dungeons, from carrying this waste above their heads, with the acids dribbling down onto their skin. But what did the women do? They cooked. They supplied workplaces with food. They sold sweets all over town, while always carrying their license plates around the neck. The ones in the center of the city, besides serving food, were used as prostitutes.
Muitas eram utilizadas na prostituição.
Prostitutes found easy clients among the white settlers. The Portuguese were far from home and family, and the indigenous Indian women and black slave women were both targets for sexual liaison.
In the early days, Portugal was such a tiny country with only just over 1 million people, and setting out to colonize practically half the world, or convert it. It was just crazy what they were trying to do. So their official instructions to people in the early years in Brazil were to breed up as much as they could.
A colonização foi essencialmente masculina.
In Brazil, the colonization was essentially male. The Portuguese woman, the family, did not come to Brazil. You can count on one hand the number of European women, in contrast with the number of European men. So, the biological integration of the African woman with the European man was natural. There wasn't this ethnic exclusiveness that took place in the United States.
The sharp distinction between white master and black slave began to blur in a country where white men, born either in Portugal or Brazil itself, had little choice but to mix with non-white women.
The Portuguese differ enormously from the British in the whole colonial enterprise. There were different forms of domination, whereas the British, at least towards the end of the 19th century, bitten by what was then called scientific racism, divided people up according to their supposed race and prohibited contact between them, and encouraged the development of racial communities. The Portuguese did not do this. I mean, they did to a certain extent, but much less. The British also fornicated, but they didn't recognize their children as such, whereas the Portuguese did, incorporated them, taught them to speak Portuguese, and I think that's the way they expanded.
The extent of sexual relations between master and slave led to thousands of mixed-race children. Some were made heirs. Most were made slaves. The dominant Catholic Church knew of such disparity but turned a blind eye. More than that, it jumped through legalistic hoops to make slavery itself not only acceptable but justifiable as a way of spreading the faith. Indeed, slave owners were obliged by law to baptize all their workers. Hundreds of ornate churches were built to be used by whites and newly converted blacks. These churches were both built and decorated by slaves. Pointedly, some quietly rebelled by sculpting pregnant angels.
One very erudite Portuguese priest who was long resident in Brazil delivered in the 17th century a particularly revealing sermon in which he argued that the trials and tribulations in this life were sure passage to comfort and peace in the next, and that slaves could take consolation in that. He also warned masters that the other could be true, and if you were too abusive of your slaves, you might find passage to the next life a fairly uncomfortable one. So he wanted to have it both ways, but he certainly wasn't arguing against the existence of the institution of slavery. The Catholic Church never took up that campaign.
Black brothers, the slavery you suffer, however hard and grinding it may be, or seems to be, is only half slavery. You are slaves in your exterior part, which is the body. However, in the other interior and nobler half, the soul, you are not a slave, but free. When you serve your masters, you do not serve them as someone who serves men, but rather as someone who serves God. Vieira, Jesuit priest.
They are kept in a state of the darkest ignorance. They are baptized for form's sake, and no doubt actually worship the images of the saints as probably resembling their African gods. Cowper, British diplomat.
For many black slaves, life was lived on two levels. They were baptized and fed the Christianity and language of the white man, but Africa persisted in music, dance, and religion. Many slaves did not adhere wholly or at all to Catholicism. They fought hard to maintain their traditional beliefs, to follow their own saints. Slave masters could not prevent their workers from keeping this link to an African past. Some owners actually declared it helped to keep their slaves happy and diverted from the monotony of their labors.
music and dance became an inextricable part of a developing Brazilian identity.
The Negroes were dripping, and yet the musicians did not cease running from one to the other and exciting them still more. The dance had arrived at such a degree of strange overexcitement when suddenly calling was heard from the house. Let all fires be extinguished, that all noise ceases, and that all the Negroes return to their cabins. In dancing and singing, they forget their ills and servitude, and only remember their native country and the time that they were free. Toussaint Sanson, Planter's Wife.
One of the outstanding differences between Brazil and the U.S. South is simply the fact that not only more slaves came to Brazil than to the U.S. South, but they continued to come for a longer period of time and later into the 19th century. So that there was a constant renewal of Africans and of African culture to Brazil. It was more reinforced and fresher in the Brazilian experience. And so they brought with them that cultural heritage. And it's ironic that today some of that is better preserved in Brazil than it is in Africa, because change continued to happen in Africa to erode those forms.
Often I have sat at night upon the threshold of the door, and I have heard the whisperings in the Negro huts, and have observed some feast or merrymaking, thus late at night, thus concealed. Costa, English sugar planter.
The masters suffered in the sense that they had to face their slaves every day without knowing whether they would end up alive or dead. So there was a lot of tension all the time. It was not an easy thing to be a master either because of that. They would go to bed with the belief that he could be poisoned by their slaves. There would be a revolt. They were afraid when they heard slaves drumming. They thought that they were preparing, something spiritual, diabolical. They believed that slaves had within their community powerful witches.
Late at night, in fields and woods, slaves performed animal sacrifices to their saints. And, in an atmosphere of killing and blood, thoughts would turn to the pursuit of freedom. So large were the numbers of slaves in Brazil, and so inherently cruel the regime, that the Portuguese felt justifiably vulnerable. By the early 1800s, occasional revolts were occurring. Resistance varied. Some slaves broke machinery, others set fire to crops, some simply went on strike. One group in 1806 refused to work and made these demands.
If my lord also wants our peace, he must agree to the following. Friday and Saturday to work for ourselves. Give us casting nets and canoes. More flour. Reduce the daily quota of sugarcane we must cut. More men to cut the wood. Someone to tend the fire at the kettles. We shall be able to play, relax, and sing any time we wish. Accepting all the above, we are ready to serve you as before.
Other slaves expressed their discontent by fleeing. But to where?
Slaves who ran away joined runaway communities called quilombos. And even cities, even the city of Rio de Janeiro was ringed by quilombos established in the forests, in the hills, quite nearby. And some of these became, had a long life that were more or less independent. They were always the object of police attempts to break them up.
I have ordered assaults against some of these quilombos with a police squad, along with soldiers of the militia, but all has been in vain. As long as they are carried out by ordinary soldiers, these attacks can never accomplish anything except to frighten the blacks and drive them away, because it is not practical for booted, uniformed and armed men to penetrate into those steep, lofty mountain jungles and caves where the blacks hide out and move about with total freedom. De Rezende, police chief.
In the cities, too, the Portuguese saw an increased confidence among blacks that freedom was on its way. At times, this belief took an aggressive form. One of the traditions that slaves had sought to maintain was a martial art called capoeira. To avoid prohibition, it had been masked as a dance. But now gangs of capoeiristas roamed the streets, using their skills to attack whites and the police. Tensions grew, and new restrictive legislation was enacted.
The games which the blacks play in the streets, plazas and beaches are forbidden, under penalty of suffering from 12 to 36 lashes. Provincial law, City of Recife, 1833. Shouting after hours is forbidden in the streets of this town. Any violator, being a slave, will suffer 25 lashes. Provincial law, town of Brejo, 1836.
Maintaining control of the slave population was becoming increasingly hard. But the need for slaves did not decline. By the 1800s, sugar and gold had been joined by tobacco and coffee as the key cash crops. Slave labor was as vital as ever. Depending on comparatively cheap human imports, slave owners were reluctant to embrace the European Industrial Revolution and its labor-saving technologies.
In 1822, Brazil secured independence from Portugal. For slaves, little changed. But the international pressure for abolition grew, particularly from Britain.
Well, Britain played a very interesting role as far as the abolition of the slave trade in Brazil was concerned. It had, if you like, a dual role. On the one hand, the British government was extremely active in establishing an anti-slavery squadron which patrolled the Atlantic. At the same time, you could argue that British involvement, economic involvement in Brazil, actually perpetuated and assisted in continuing slavery in Brazil. Britain imported slave-produced sugar from Brazil, slave-produced coffee from Brazil, right until the end of the 19th century.
But an end was in sight. Some slaves were now offered limited freedoms.
I, Antonio Pereira Freitas, state that I possess a slave of more or less 9 years of age, which slave I liberate and possess in a liberated condition from this day forward forever, with the declaration that he served me while I live, and that during this entire period of my life he not attempt to free himself by legal means, since he is already free as a result of this, my decision. And if at some time he should disobey me, or show some ingratitude toward me, he will lose the freedom which I am granting him, and will remain subject to enslavement to my person and any heirs. Freitas, slave owner.
Offering conditional freedom was seen for what it was, a last gasp attempt to deflect abolition. During the 19th century, 1 million new slaves from throughout Western Africa arrived at Brazilian harbors. In Rio, the slaves outnumbered the rest of the population 2 to 1.
My hand shakes with indignation as I call the imperial government's attention to this trafficking. On sale are, for example, the services of Georgina, black, 1 year old, valued at 20 reis. The services of Orminda, a mulatta, 3 months old, and Leonidia, a few days old. Nabucco, abolitionist.
The continued British confiscation of slave ships and its restriction on trade meant that the transportation of Africans that had begun 350 years earlier would have to end.
Within Brazil itself, larger and larger numbers of slaves were simply abandoning plantations, wrecking the whole system. Plantation owners decided to opt for abolition and hoped they could coerce some slaves to stay on. On the 13th of May, 1888, the Princess Regent Isabel proclaimed the so-called Aurea Law. Brazil became the last major country officially to abolish slavery.
This was the final Emancipation Act, but of course even after that those who had formerly been slaves owe nothing, were given no compensation and so on, and so were forced to remain on the land or to exist in other ways. In other words, although they were legally free, they were still bound economically to the land, to the mines or the other occupations they were forced to undertake.
The blacks are the ones in prisons, living in the slums, not having jobs. Nowadays, they're not slaves belonging to one master. They are slaves of the system. The executioner has changed. It's much more sophisticated. The whip is almost invisible, but it is still felt.
No country imported more slaves than Brazil. Even today, the majority of black people throughout the Americas speak Portuguese. Following abolition, there was a deliberate policy to draw in white settlers, Italians, Germans, Spaniards. But almost half of today's 170 million population remains non-white.
The legacy of slavery to modern Brazil is huge. Racial inequality, the fact that the majority of blacks are poor, that they are not as well educated as whites. But you also have positive results, not of slavery itself, but of the slaves. In terms of the music, in terms of the religion, made Brazilian culture much richer than it would have been without the presence of Africans in Brazil.
The heady mix of music, religion, dance and sport can sometimes blur the less appealing legacies of slavery. Homelessness, street children, unemployment. A country built on sugar has left a bitter taste in the mouths of many.
Brazil looks like a colonial society, and the same elite continue to rule Brazil. And even though we now have a democratic constitution and liberal democracy and all the rest of it, the country continues to be dominated by a very small percentage of the population, mainly white. So in that sense, you know, of a small group, extremely rich, Brazil's the world's leader in inequality. And so you have this small 10% with most of the resources, and the rest condemned to, poverty.
As Brazil commemorates its 500th birthday, no other country shares its racial mix. The delineation between black and white is blurred, with the overwhelming majority somewhere in the middle. But white remains the color of aspiration, and black the color of a history that some would prefer to forget.